recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, for questions.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you so much to Mr. Shafir for coming here, for your incredible courage. I will make sure that my sons hear your testimony. I think it's really important for my children to consistently hear exactly what the Holocaust means, and again, so that we don't repeat it. And Mr. Gold, you're absolutely right. Humankind, what it can lead to if we do nothing. So thank you again for Chairwoman and my colleagues for holding this important hearing today. It is imperative that we honor the victims of the Holocaust, learn from the lessons of history, and continue to fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. And I ran a campaign to take on hate in Michigan. I would always tell the young people, you have to take on hate with action. And so the week, I'm really honored to be a co-sponsor of the Never Again Education Act, as we make sure that our children and every other generation understands what it means when we talk about the Holocaust. When I visited the Holocaust Memorial Center in Farmington Hills in Michigan with my young son, Adam, I remember he spent the day reading everything he could. When I had called beforehand, they said, well, he might be too young for the visuals. I said, nope. If he can see that stuff in video games, if he can see a lot of that stuff on TV, he can see the reality of what is actually real. And so I wanted him to see it. And so he was reading this whole wall. You can look it up online, a whole wall of these news clippings. And even the news clippings documenting unspeakable atrocities of the Holocaust. And something I'll never forget, when he looked up at me and he asked, Mom, he calls me Mama. He said, Mama, why did it take so long for people to do something about this? Because even at that young age, you know what he noticed? He noticed the years before we finally set Jews free. And at such a young age, he recognized how slow the international community was actually taking action. He could not comprehend how the world stood back as this brutality unfolded before him. And so, you know, Dr. Friedberg, as a historian, and when you spoke about it, it was so important because it resonates with me about what's happening even across the world, and Mr. Gold talked about it, but even what's happening to Muslims in China. I'm really fearful we're going to find out much too late about what's happening there. But what can you tell me about the environment that enabled Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to rise to power? What can we, you know, history teach us about how the democratic process can devolve into a regime capable of such atrocities?
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman, very much, and also for sharing your personal perspective. I've brought my squirmy young son here with me today. What I can tell you is that when you study the Holocaust and beyond Nazi Germany, what you see is that hate is only part of the story. And it would be a mistake and too comforting for us to think that if we can just inoculate ourselves against racism, that people will not do bad things to other people. But what we find when we study the Holocaust in its specificity is much of what enabled the Nazi rise to power had to do with motivations that are much more relatable. Motivations like career aspirations, greed, fear, opportunism. We can see, for example, that the Nazi regime, and some of our fellows at the museum have researched this, offered great opportunities for women to be in roles that they had not been able to be in before, and many women were complicit in the killing process as a result. The Eastern Front, for example, offered a kind of, I guess the opposite of a Wild West, but an environment in which a lot of social norms were broken down. So I want us to be careful not to think that there was some kind of brainwashing of the German people, but that also, for example, the Nuremberg laws of 1935, most of what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany was done legally. It was done in a framework of laws. This was not criminal. It was actually the government's action.
Adam noticed that. He saw the slow but sure enough taking away people's properties and things. Yeah, he noticed that.
Smart kid. So as an example, in the Nuremberg laws, I'll just give one example. Jewish doctors were no longer allowed to treat so-called Aryan patients. Think about that. If you're a medical resident and your chief resident is Jewish and suddenly he's gone, maybe you don't object so much because this opens a door to you and you're just going to be quiet. You're maybe afraid to make noise and it's an opportunity. So I want us to think about that we study the history in its precision in that way because we see how any one of us could have been part of that process, whether or not we were a racist or anti-Semite in our hearts.
And I want you to know, Mr. Shafir, one of the things that spoke to me why I took my son to the Holocaust Museum is when he was 9 years old, he's 14 now. When he was 9 years old, he heard me talk to his father about this awful cartoon that was in USA Today that depicted Muslims in a way that it would invoke violence towards Muslims. And I was just talking to his father, almost whispering to him, but he heard, and he comes into the bedroom, and he's like, Mama, don't worry, don't worry. If anybody asks if I'm Muslim, I will lie and tell them I'm not. And at that moment, it struck me. I was like, oh, honey, no. And we can't allow, this to continue, this kind of form of oppression. I think, all of you are doing incredibly important work. And I think I loved seeing the NAACP here because an African-American Baptist pastor said it beautifully in Detroit. He said, we're not a country that's divided. We're a country that's disconnected. And we need to connect in understanding all of us as fellow human beings that never, ever deserve to be targeted based on who we are or faith or anything like that. So thank you all so much for your incredible testimony. And thank you, Chairwoman, for your leadership.
Thank you, thank you.
May I add something to?
Yes, yes.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for taking your son to actually witness something like that. It's very important, and I hope that, and I wish that more mothers or more parents would take their children to places like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentle lady from California, Ms. Katie Porter, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My colleague and I have the same age of sons, and my son Luke, when he came to Washington, I tried to interest him in so many things.